Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the ISU Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. I'm here with Jen Bentley, the Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Well, thanks, Fred. It's a sunny day here, and I know our topic today is the climate and weather, and of course, it's mid-30s. I would like sunny and 75 if you can make that happen, Fred.
Well, I don't know about that, but maybe our speaker can help us out there. Dennis Todey is joining us today. He is the director of the Midwest Climate Hub in Ames. He is a native Iowan with his BS and PhD from Iowa State in meteorology and agricultural meteorology. He spent 2 stints in South Dakota, first completing his MS in South Dakota School of Mines and Technology, and most recently as associate professor and state climatologist for South Dakota at South Dakota State University. He's well known regionally as a speaker and a media source on climate issues, and he is the former president of the American Association of State Climatologists. Dennis, welcome to the Iowa State University Dairy Team podcast.
Thanks for having me. And I'm sorry I can't help you with making it 75 and sunny for you. I keep waiting for that control, but that's never been given to me. And I'm not sure if I ever want it, because somebody's going to need rain, and it's going to rain on somebody's parade or somebody's wedding day. So better that we just talk about what's going to happen.
There we go. Dennis, for our listeners out there who may not be familiar, can you explain what the Climate Hub work is and what you do there?
Sure, be happy to do that. The Climate Hubs were spun up under the Obama administration with previous Secretary and expected now Secretary Vilsack to deal with larger scale climate issues and changes in climate and agriculture. Over time, our work has broadened so that about anything in that climate and agriculture realm is something that we can deal with and do deal with. We deal with the wide range of agriculture, obviously row crops, specialty crops. People may not know that most of their canned pumpkin in the country comes from one location in our area, that's central Illinois. So we try to deal with these smaller crops along the way. Also on the forestry side of the house, there's a partner organization called the Northern Forest Climate Hub who deals with forestry issues. So we deal with the rest of agriculture issues. So we have been around now about 6 years, looking forward to continue working with weather and climate issues for agriculture. And our connection, especially with Iowa State, is since Extension is without a climate specialist right now, we help out our partners there. ISU Extension is a good partner of ours for a number of reasons.
Thanks, Dennis. And yesterday you were on our monthly webinar series giving us the climate outlook for 2021. And can you give us a sense of current temperatures compared to where you expect them to be, above or below? I kind of feel like they're above right now, but what's kind of the sense here in Iowa?
You're right on. It's really kind of interesting that most of Iowa has some snow right now, though it's been disappearing here a bit more over the last couple days. And we've had some decent snowfall amounts across the state, but overall our temperatures for the winter and even back to the latter part of the fall have been running above average generally. That we had a cold period back in October, people may remember, where we had a sharp turn towards cold, and then you think back to latter part of October and November, we were very warm, had some very lovely days. So we've not been as warm as that, but generally the better summary during the winter has been a lack of really severe cold and a lack of long-lived cold. That's really the case here, and especially further north up into the northern plains. We've had relatively warm temperatures overall.
We're not quite into, we're just into mid-January, so winter season. What does our current snowfall amounts equal to as water, and how does this compare to precipitation, rain versus snow?
It's a really good question, because we get perception sometimes that we've got a lot of snow, but lots of times that amount of snow doesn't equate to a huge amount of water. We have a very dry soils and dry landscape in Iowa and some states around, so any moisture is helpful. But while we have snow cover across most of the state, the amount of water in the snow really is generally less than an inch of water. As of yesterday, the last map I'd seen, parts of central Iowa over to east central Iowa, we have maybe around an inch of water because they've had some heavier snowfalls. But overall, we've not we've not put a lot of water on the landscape, the snow that we've seen. So the melting has added some to the soil moisture. It's always beneficial, but the amounts we're talking about still don't match with what we're going to need to have, especially in western parts of the state, to help out on some of the dryness conditions.
Interesting question. Somebody called and said they missed the program and wanted to know where the archive was. And they asked me, they said, okay, is snow like we've had as good as a rain in the spring? With frozen ground, does it actually go? And I know you'd said no, that on frozen ground it goes immediately away, but we're not froze very deep either.
No, any moisture at this point is helpful. We're not going to argue that. Big snowfalls can contain a lot of moisture in them that would be beneficial. When I was up in South Dakota, the rangeland guys loved big snowfalls in the spring. They hated dealing with them from a livestock perspective, but they loved the moisture they got out of them on their rangeland. But the snow we've had so far, you're talking less than an inch probably of liquid that we've had involved, which is nice, but some of that will sublimate or evaporate, and some will enter the moisture, but that's not a big game changer. We need to have several 1+ inch rainfalls once we get thawed in the spring that I'll start feeling more comfortable.
We're always, when we see snow, we think it's cold, but what are the current soil temperatures sitting at right now, and how does this compare to other years?
That's actually a really good question. Right now, about the northern third of the state still has frozen soil temperatures. Most of the rest of the state is right at freezing or slightly above, and that's a fairly common thing here and around us too. We had some concerns with the dry soils that we were going to have very deep frost penetration into the ground this year. But again, getting back to that lack of cold, we've not had that frost penetrate very deeply into the soil, maybe up to 8 inches in cases or something like that. So that's kind of where we're sitting right now. How this compares for other times of the year is something we've been having a conversation about this week, because we don't have good climatologies of soil temperatures where we can say, here's where we are compared to a number of other years. There are some states who have some longer term measurements, can start getting some comparison. Unfortunately, Iowa's not one of those states where we have a good long-term set of data where we can say this compares to XY year or this far above average. Unfortunately, we did have a conversation yesterday as regional climate folks comparing some things. We can sometimes have unfrozen soils at this time of year, but usually it's when you have a snowpack, that you have a fairly decent snowpack. The soils are not frozen because it's insulated by that snowpack. This year is kind of an oddity that we're not frozen, but we don't have that much of a snowpack. That's kind of the strange condition that we're dealing with right now. So mostly about southern 2/3 of the state, mostly unfrozen, northern third of the state, frozen to, maybe a few inches, that sort of thing.
You had also referenced the U.S. Drought Monitor, and I know our extension agronomist, Brian Lang, when he puts out his crop notes, references that quite a bit as kind of a way to monitor droughts throughout Iowa, but maybe some of our audiences are not as familiar with the U.S. Drought Monitor. So could you kind of explain that and what it's looking like for Iowa? I know yesterday there was some comments about Northwest Iowa, particularly being more in that drought situation.
Correct. Brief background, the U.S. Drought Monitor is a product that has been around about 20 years now. It was started after some drought issues in the late 90s that we didn't have a good way of assessing what was happening in drought across the country. So it started with some folks in DC said, hey, let's put this together, and it has grown over time. It is a weekly product, comes out on Thursday. The data that are included end on Tuesday morning, so that anything that happens after, say if you have a 5-inch rain at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, that doesn't get included in that week's drought monitor. And the goal of the process is you've got a national author each week, one person who draws this map across the country, and they categorize everything from no drought up to D4, D0 through D4 categories, and assess what the drought situation is. And it's not only agriculture, tries to bring in a bunch of different issues, water, ecological types of issues to understand what's happening in the way of drought. So it's kind of become the de facto assessment of what's happening in drought across the country. The drought monitor has not changed appreciably since the late fall, and the reason that is during the wintertime we don't expect much precipitation. We don't get much precipitation, so it doesn't change very quickly. If we get a big rainfall event or a really big snowfall event, we might increase the situation, but we really don't change very much. Most of the issues now are more the western half of Iowa, a little bit in northern Iowa up in the northeast, but the western half was the place that received the least rainfall throughout last year, starting late winter, early spring, and continuing throughout the growing season. Eastern Iowa had some dryness issues, but they were alleviated for the most part. So the drought monitor situation is most of Western Iowa is covered in some category, and the worst of it is there are pockets in the Southwest that are up to D2 severe drought and up to D3 in the northeast part of the state, extreme drought. The situation largely right now is because of the dry soils. And that's why it's unlikely to change very much in a depiction, because we just don't, as we talked about with the snow, we don't get a lot of precipitation that adds more moisture to the soil during the wintertime. We would expect more of those changes to start once spring comes and you start getting more of the potential bigger rainfalls, that we could see some improvement at that point.
You know, one of the climate words we hear a lot is La Nina. Looking out, say 60, 90 days, explain what La Nina is and what do those trends tell us?
Sure. La Nina and its opposite phase, El Nino, are near and dear to my heart, because that was part of what I did for my PhD working at Iowa State. So I always enjoy talking about it. What we're talking about when we're talking about La Nina or El Nino, we're talking about changes in sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. Why does that affect us? Because the Pacific is so large. When you have changes in the temperature of the ocean, that changes atmospheric patterns, and then those atmospheric patterns can work their way up over us. Because we're not close to the Pacific, those changes are not, it's not like a specific, you flip a switch and things change. Things change in the Pacific, and that changes something in between and in between. So it's not a direct relationship with us. But when we have El Ninos or La Ninas, we do have some better indications about what we can say at longer terms. So most of the outlooks that have been, the longer outlooks at 30, 60, 90 days, even longer, since last fall, have been based on what La Nina is doing, and have all kind of followed along that way. Especially during the wintertime, what that means for us is Iowa's kind of in a boundary area, unfortunately. Areas to our north and east have a better chance of being wetter, and that's kind of been the case this time. And then the plains, the central to southern plains, tend to be drier, and that has been more the case so far this winter. Temperature-wise, generally the southern U.S. is warmer during these. There's a chance of a little bit of cooler up in the northern plains. It can sometimes affect us, but not always. So that's what we've been watching and monitoring that situation. The concern for us is that those same kind of patterns extend into spring. Problem is, if that La Nina were to stay with us into summer, La Ninas here during the summertime do increase our drought risk. Not a huge amount, but they do increase our drought risk. So that's why we've talked about drought already. We're monitoring that very closely, because we have these very dry conditions already. And there is somewhat of an increased risk of being drier into summer. That should raise our level of concern. Again, we're not raising big flags about it, but we should monitor this closely and start thinking a little bit about, what if things are dry, what would that mean for us, and how should we deal with that? Right now, the new outlooks that just came out today continue saying summer should not be too much of a problem for us, but we'll continue to monitor those as we go along. When I talk about the outlooks, I talk about those from the National Weather Service's Climate Prediction Center. They release them on the third Thursday of the month, so they just came out this morning as we're doing this taping.
Yeah, and it always seems like when I have conversations with my brothers, they kind of count down the days when they can start getting their planters geared up and getting out to the fields. And so you think this is maybe allowing for some earlier field access, but then also what I hear from you is maybe once we get those crops in the ground, then we need to really monitor during that growing season could be a concern.
Right. That's the pluses and minuses of this whole situation. Compared to some previous years, I do expect us to be able to get into the field no worse than average and maybe a little bit ahead of average. And people maybe should try to take advantage of that a little bit because even if we do get some, unless we get very big, heavy rainfalls, I don't expect there to be too much of a problem, because as dry as soils are right now, an inch of rainfall might just slow you down a day or two and you might be able to get back out. So that may be an advantage. Another advantage is that dry soils, assuming that your soils are moist enough at the surface to get a crop started, if the crop recognizes dry soils, they will develop a good root system trying to find moisture. So that is another advantage of the dry soil conditions. That said, we do need, X amount of moisture to grow whatever crop we're trying to grow. So we've got to have that moisture somewhere along the way. And if we don't have that moisture in the soil bank, that means we've got to have more of that come in along the way. And we're going to be at higher risk for longer dry periods. We always have some dry periods throughout the year. So that's my concern, is that as the summer goes on, we're going to need to have fairly regular rainfalls to reduce the amount of stress on whatever crop we're talking about here. So that's where my concern lies. Hopefully not, but that's why we're going to monitor this and keep close eyes on it.
Dennis, thanks for all the great information here today. And as we conclude, any considerations, or what's the top 1 or 2 considerations farmers should investigate after hearing the outlook you gave?
Just 1 or 2, huh?
Well,
obviously make sure your crop insurance is there. Think a little bit about what your water and soil moisture situations are like. And if those, if dryness continues, what you could do, maybe reduce your plant population a little bit, maybe set your target yield goal down a little bit so you don't over fertilize and save some of the money that way. It's going to be tough calls this year, obviously, because of crop prices. People are probably going to be looking for, whatever crop they can, but we don't want to overshoot when we may not have that soil moisture available.
I do want to note that the webinar you presented this week will also be posted on our Extension Dairy Team website, and we'll include the link with this podcast for those listeners who want to see it and gain a more in-depth interpretation of the information. Dennis, thanks for being on this podcast today.
Always happy to talk about weather and climate and ag issues.
Very good. Thanks for joining us today, and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from Iowa State Extension Dairy Team.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu/diversity/EXT.